This video is brought to you by the University Writing Center, a unit of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. You can contact us at uwc.utexas.edu.
Hey, Tristin.
Hey, Mac.
You ready to have a discussion for the University Writing Center on audience?
I am. Let's do it.
All right. So as a jumping off point, we'll use Jodie Nicotra's textbook, Becoming Rhetorical. So in the first chapter of Becoming Rhetorical, Nicotra refers to audience as a complex concept, and that the term generally refers to the intended recipient or recipients of an act of communication. And she offers two types of audiences: addressed audiences, who are the people who actually receive a text and interact with it, and invoked audience, who are imagined by the author. And she also gives helpful guidelines for analyzing audience. But Tristin, I want to ask you, how do you make sense of audience?
I think it's really important that Nicotra begins with that idea that it's complex. And even in the dichotomy she presents as the addressed audience and the invoked audience, both of those categories get more complicated too. And they aren't as distinct from one another as this kind of diagram would make us think. And I know one thing that we talk about a lot when we think about learning to be good rhetoricians is that these aren't just dictionary vocabulary terms that you can learn once and then be done with. This is something that we are practicing with and using to analyze and to get to something else. So for example, when we talk about addressed audiences, Nicotra phrases it as the people who actually receive a text and interact with it, but sometimes there are people addressed in the text. A good example is an open letter. So if I write an open letter to a public figure, I don't know whether the person that I have addressed that text to is going to receive it, but I know that other people are going to read it and they're going to imagine their version of that public figure as they're reading it. So I have an audience that's invoked because I've imagined them, and the person I'm addressing is also imagined for me to some degree because I might not know that public figure. So and then they're also potentially reading with an imagined version. So I'm imagining people who are imagining someone in even the most, in theory, simple addressed context.
I mean, I think that's probably why Nicotra refers to it as a complex concept. Because hearing that, we kind of go, well, what are we supposed to do?
It is complicated. And so I like to think about audience as something that I need to think about as a communicator, a writer, or a speaker, but also something that I am, because I'm certainly also receiving communications all the time. I'm receiving advertising all the time. I'm receiving political arguments. People are imagining me and imagining appeals to me as an audience. And how can I break down what is being offered to me and what does that mean I'm being identified as? And then also, how can I participate in that same kind of thing to get my message to the people I want to get it to?
I mean, I think what you're talking about is great because it points to how fundamental the concept of audience is to rhetoric. And it's like all of our concepts, writing and rhetoric concepts, they're both fundamental and they're always so complicated too. It's not like the fundamental stuff is sort of, they're not layups, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think for me, the reason it's so fundamental is if we think of rhetoric as persuasion, or sort of how we use language or symbols or whatever we want to say to affect somebody else, to affect one another, then you can't think about rhetoric without also thinking about, well, why might that person be affected?
I know that you have in the past said you don't like talking about audience in class. So maybe this would be a good point to talk about why audience is so difficult to deal with.
Yeah, it makes me nervous because I don't think you can talk about audience and be overly confident. Or rather, you're trying to figure out how to research it and make sense of it and argue for a particular understanding of audience. And you can do that, there's some things you can do to make sure that's a little bit more legitimate than just winging it. But at the same time, it's tough because I think we like to think of audience as this easily knowable thing that you can simply point to if you just analyze the website, or if you know that the New York Times editorial board leans left, that oh, it's liberals. But that's so general too. So for me, the trick is saying, all right, audience is clearly an essential concept to think about when you're analyzing communication. But how do you account for the fact that you're doing a little bit of inferring, that you sort of need to make the argument for audience as you understand it?
You know, I agree. I think it's a problem if we act like audience is something that we can know with certainty and then appeal to in this mechanistic way, because
Right.
that takes out a lot of the things that we want to be able to do as rhetoricians. And it also makes it impossible for us to question what's being operated on us.
One thing I think is valuable about a rhetorical understanding of audience is that it really can foreground how the text itself or the author is appealing to people. And one thing you've mentioned, Nicotra talks about too, we think of rhetoric in terms of how is the author using emotions to appeal to the audience? You know, is their character, their ethos used to persuade the audience? So everything's framed in terms of audience in terms of an external thing, yeah. But you can also think of it in like the internal qualities, like you were talking about earlier. So it speaks again to how complex it all is. But at the same time, to say that you can't know with 100% certainty who the whole audience is doesn't mean it's all relative or it's all up in the air and it's just complete guesswork. You know, so and that's the balance. That's why it's difficult.
Which I guess brings us to the idea of how do we approach audience then? And I, as you were talking, was thinking, right, a lot of the things that we can glean empirically do help us to figure out broad strokes. Is this an appropriate venue? What is the discourse going on in this place? What seem to be the expectations? And this is where I really want to stress one way I approach audience. Is to start with that analysis portion and figure out what's already being said and how it's being portrayed and how persuasion is supposed to be happening in this situation, or influence, or just even the construction of what this scene is, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And thanks for talking with me about audience. And remember, you can find information about the University Writing Center at uwc.utexas.edu.